Hey, we're here. We did it. .NET Rocks. I'm Carl Franklin.
And I'm Richard Campbell.
And we're here with 3 guests on our Writing APIs and All About APIs panel. Shawn Wildermuth is here. Hi, Shawn.
Hey there.
Irina Scurtu is here. Hi, Irina.
Hi.
Heather Downing is here.
Aloha.
And we of course need to start this show as we always start every show. But first, Richard Campbell, how you doing, man?
Busy as all get out, man. I got nothing to complain about. Like, there's lots to work on. I've been home a lot. Obviously, the streaming rig, been tinkering with it endlessly because they're very popular right now.
They are.
It's important to get all this stuff tuned up. You've been building some crazy stuff.
I've been building really crazy stuff. So we're using vMix here to do all this compositing and stuff, and it supports all these callers. All these callers are coming in right through vMix. And by the way, panel, somebody's phone is on their desk and the microphone is picking up the bzz, bzz, and this is just
might be me.
All the things.
Yeah, it's all the stuff.
Mute all the things.
But anyway, yes, I also am rebranding PWOP Studios to be in the live streaming production business, to do sort of what we're doing here, but with multiple scenes in vMix, and to take all that off of the speaker's responsibility. So I actually give them an app where they can switch their own scenes and they can advance their slides and all that stuff. And they don't have to know anything. They can just go to a browser.
I liked that there was nothing to install. You literally sent me a link and boop, here I am.
Yeah.
That was impressive.
So anyway, that's really good. If you're thinking of doing some online conferences and online meetings and just want to get beyond the Zoom Brady Bunch effect and do something a little more spectacular,
I like a little Brady Bunch, but no, I'm with you.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, let's get started with Better Know a Framework. Roll the crazy music.
Awesome.
And crazy.
Yeah, if anybody's confused right now, if you're watching the stream and you didn't hear the music, it's because we don't play the music when we record. We add it in it later.
That's right.
It's all post-production effects.
And my multi-quarter stopped, so I'm not sure why. I'm going to try to restart it with a different
And by the way, I'm not recording myself at all. I don't have my loop in.
That.
Do you want me to loop in?
Unless you don't care if we lose this audio. I don't know.
I don't want to lose the audio, but I'll. Right. You want to give me a minute? I'll just hop the microphone across.
Sure. Yeah. Why not?
Yeah. Give me 1 second.
Every little bit helps.
Yeah.
And
you're right.
While we're doing that, I'll record. I'll do the Better Know framework. So here's my Better Know framework. If you go to 1678.pwop.me, turns out that Azure has remote rendering now, or I don't know if it's who owns it. Obviously Azure owns it, but essentially the HoloLens 2, you can essentially ship off rendering of the HoloLens 2 to an Azure service, Azure mixed reality service. So there you go. It solves the challenge of viewing complex 3D models on HoloLens 2 without losing polygon detail or spending valuable time downsampling. So if your HoloLens isn't cutting the rendering, you can now just go use Azure remote rendering. And there's the link to it for more information, 1678.pwop.me. It's pretty cool. I love this whole new world of shipping off CPU cycles to the cloud, and especially GPU stuff. It turns out that Azure has SKUs for VMs that have GPUs. So if you really want to spend $1 a day or $1 an hour, with one of these big VMs that has GPU stuff to do rendering, to do streaming, to do all that stuff, they're there in Azure. It's pretty cool. What do you think?
You guys hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
That's awesome, dude. Love it. That's really neat.
And it's pretty cool. I don't have a HoloLens 2, but if I did, I'd be hooking it up to Azure.
I'm still waiting for mine.
Yeah.
Oh yeah? You ordered
one? Yes. I ordered
one.
Not cheap. I am that nerd. I am that nerd.
Wow. I have one of the original ones, but the spousal acceptance factor of that kind of cost for a toy is not very high.
Yeah, I don't have that problem, so there are some benefits there, but I will tell you that I'm completely obsessed with being able to do VR and mixed reality right now. I play Beat Saber twice a day to keep up my energy, and I'm interested in building things that are more active, and HoloLens makes that happen.
That's pretty cool.
Okay, so HoloLens is actually part of your exercise program.
It will be when it gets here, but right now I'm using the Oculus Quest.
Awesome. Okay, that's very cool.
Good. All right. Well, Richard Campbell, who is talking to us today?
Well, we only talk about APIs so often, but I grabbed a comment here off of show 1511, which is from January of 2018.
Wow.
Remember 2018 when you could go outside and everything?
Yeah.
And that was a show we did with Daryl. Yeah, babe, take some pictures. It's fun. That was a show we did with Daryl Miller talking about OpenAPI.net, right? And that was, specifically a conversation around how we build APIs that work against multiple languages.
Yeah.
Which I think is an absolute talking point here and now. So we were clearly thinking about those kinds of problems, and OpenAPI, of course, continue to mature. 2-year-old conversation now, but still super relevant. And this comment comes from Max, who says, with OPI, let me say it again. With OpenAPI defining the behavior in API in a standardized way, it makes communicating with it a breeze. I've really enjoyed working with it, but it could still be better. Certain languages still don't integrate with it particularly well. And that, to me, is super interesting, just that problem of, you think about, we're continuing to have more languages in our development stacks, right? And remember, we've had folks working in Haskell for back-end services. Have you built APIs that are tolerant to that they're able to call to it reliably? And so, Max is pressing against this point 2 years ago, but still pressing against it now. So it'd be great to loop back on this subject. So Max, thank you so much for your comment. A copy of Music to Code By is on its way to you. And if you'd like a copy of Music to Code By, write a comment on the website at .rocks.com or on the Facebooks. We publish every show there. And if you comment there and I read it on the show, we'll send you a copy of Music to Code By.
And definitely follow us on Twitter. I'm at Carl Franklin. He's at Rich Campbell. Send us a tweet. Sign it virtually yours.
Nice.
So, .NET Rocks humor in the age of the coronavirus.
That was deep, man. I got to think about that for a minute.
Speaking of the coronavirus, before we get into APIs, let's stay human here for a little bit. I was diagnosed with the coronavirus on March 29th, but that was about a month after I had symptoms, which lasted about a week, maybe a little more. So it lingered that long. And then I got retested. The first test I had was a nasal swab, which is quite uncomfortable. But, I could deal with it. Blowing my nose for an hour afterwards, no problem. But the second one was a back of throat swab.
Right.
That was just last Friday. And
it's not necessarily fun either. When somebody sticks a foot-long Q-tip up your nose,
right? And
that's very special.
They know you're going to cough. Well, this one was back of throat, so they actually stuck it in the back of my throat and initiated my gag reflex. They know you're going to cough.
Right.
They're done up in hazmat suits, like the clear plastic shield over the eyes.
Sure. And so because you're going to come at them.
Yeah. So I did gag.
I've seen anyway,
that one. I just want to say that one came back negative.
So, congratulations.
Yeah. So I have antibodies. Anybody want a pint of plasma?
Yeah.
Are you selling it?
I may. eBay.
Nice.
All right, that's all I got.
I'm afraid people are going to take you up on it too, right? That you'd wish that was a joke.
No, I know it's not a joke. It's kind of funny, but I'm perfectly willing to donate plasma or blood.
Yeah, you're going to be one of the lab rats now, right? Yeah. They're going to be taking blood from you as often as you can give it.
I'll save as many.
And I personally know from experience, there's a lot of Carl Franklin. You can have some blood.
Yeah, there's a lot. Substance over style, baby. I got a lot of substance. I'm sorry, Shawn. I cut you off. You were going to comment there.
Oh, no. I've seen those people all decked out. I watched E.T.
Yeah.
E.T.? Oh, Entertainment Tonight.
E.T. I thought I'd use a topical
E.T. the extraterrestrial.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
The bubble suits. But I think one of the things about evolving the
You figured
testing
that
is
out,
getting away. Yeah, we'll fix that. It'll be funny in post. Don't worry. Edit
I
point.
doubt it. I doubt it.
Yeah. If you're
Remember, you guys-
watching this,
Remember, you guys are doing better than any of the late night talk show hosts having to do things in their bedroom.
Right.
yeah, it's true. We got better equipment, I think.
I actually have a funny
think so.
slider. I can turn it up and turn the suck
Yeah, yeah.
slider down. So
I tried the brightness knob, but it don't work.
sorry. One more time, Shawn. You were going to comment.
No, I'm not going to repeat that
No?
joke.
Okay.
You know, if you say it again, it doesn't get funnier.
It doesn't. It does
All
not.
right. So what the heck are we talking about? Building APIs?
Yeah, let's do the intro though. Still in an edit
Oh,
point here.
Yeah, we're still
Yeah,
in
you
an
got to
edit point.
introduce these people.
That's true. And if I
And
had
as we're,
bios ready-
I did make the show in the editor too. So if you want to go post stuff up in
okay.
there, yeah.
Let me look there.
Even though our names
Yeah.
are on the screen.
Here we go.
They are on the screen,
Well, yeah, but I want
and you're in the end.
I want to access your bios here.
Bios.
So actually, let me just add these bios to a screen that I can read. This is part of watching the sausage being made, folks.
Yeah.
This is what you paid for when you came to NDC.
Yes. We only sound clever on the podcast because we have professional editors.
Irina, Scurtu is how you say your last name, is it? Or is there a better?
Yeah. It's okay. I know
That's a very
it's not easy to pronounce.
How would you pronounce it?
Scurtu.
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 I can say
Yep.
that.
But you can see
Nice.
the Russian accent even
Yeah.
when I pronounce it.
Scurtu. All right. Let me move this over here, and we're ready to go. All right.
All right.
All right, it's time to introduce our esteemed panel. First of all, directly below me, for those who are watching the video, is Mr. Shawn Wildermuth. He has been tinkering with computers and software since he got a VIC-20 back in the early 80s. As a Microsoft MVP since 2003, he's also involved with Microsoft as an ASP.NET Insider and Client Dev Insider. I didn't know there was such a thing as a Client Dev Insider.
I don't think there is anymore.
Wow. Okay. Well, anyway, he's author of over 20 Pluralsight courses. We've written 8 books as an international conference speaker and one of the wilder minds. You can reach him at his blog at wildermuth.com. He's also making his first feature-length documentary about software developers called Hello World. And is that out?
It's
Hello?
not out. It's finished. We're just in the film festivals being canceled process.
Ah, awesome. Well, you can check that out at helloworldfilm.com.
Thanks.
And let's talk about, geez, my God. I'm trying to read. This is in the third person. All right. Next, below me and to my right, my left, my right to you.
Your
Stage left. Yes, stage left. All right. Is Irina Scurtu. She is She is a Microsoft MVP for developer technologies, software architect, CTT plus technical trainer, and Microsoft certified trainer, always in a quest for latest trends and best practices in architecture, .NET, and the world around it. Irina Scurtu has more than 700 hours of delivered training, workshops, and presentation, being passionate about domain-driven design and microservices with all their ups and downs. She's the founder of .NET IASI. Did I say that right?
Yes.
Look at that.
Almost.
The .NET IASI. You say it.
Yes. It's hard to pronounce.
Yash.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. She is the founder of .NET Yash user group, where she tries to gather people that are willing to share their knowledge with others. And Heather Downing. You know what? Let me see if
Directly below me.
hang on one sec. just realized something.
It's not a good time to tell Heather she's not on the show.
No.
Nice.
It's not you. It's
All right,
not
you don't
you,
need
it's
me.
It's not you, it's me.
We can be friends.
Yeah. Hang on just a second. I apologize for this, guys. I just want to make sure my recording is being recorded, if you know what I'm saying.
All right, so I'll look at that too, because that would be good for mine.
That'd be good for you. Yeah.
Mine's running.
Good. Try to make this work. Hey. All right, good. And on the recording, you'll notice that my voice just changed. It's because of where I was recording. Everything's okay now. So Heather Downing, you know what? Maybe I should do that whole thing again.
Okay.
All right, so
Go
now
for
it's
it.
time. All right, so now it's time to introduce our panel, our esteemed panel. Shawn Wildermuth has been tinkering with computers and software since he got a VIC-20 back in the early 80s. As a Microsoft MVP since 2003, he's also involved with Microsoft as an ASP.NET Insider and Client Dev Insider. He's the author of over 20 Pluralsight courses. He's written 8 books. He's an international conference speaker and one of the wilder minds. You can reach him at wildermuth.com. He's also making his first feature-length documentary about software developers today called Hello World, the film. And you can see more about it at helloworldfilm.com. It's Shawn Wildermuth.
Hey there.
Yay.
Happy to be here virtually.
Irina Scurtu is a Microsoft MVP for developer technologies, software architect, C++, did I say that right? CTT Plus technical trainer and Microsoft certified trainer, always in a quest for latest trends and host practices in architecture, .NET, and the world around it. Irina has more than 700 hours of delivered trainings, workshops, and presentations, being passionate about domain-driven design and microservices with all their ups and downs. She's the founder of .NET Yash user group, where she tries to gather people that are willing to share their knowledge with others. It's Irina Scurtu. Yay.
Yay.
We'll have to put in an audience, right?
Yeah, there you go.
And Heather Downing is a passionate coder and entrepreneur. She has experience working with Fortune 500 companies building enterprise-level mobile and .NET applications. She spends her spare time at tech conferences supporting the growth of new developers of all genders, ages, and backgrounds. When not coding, Heather spends her time as a competitive equestrian and learning the art of mounted archery. She's basically, what's Cat?
Xena.
She's an elf. Yeah.
Who is it? Who is it? Cat
All of the
from-
above.
Yeah. Okay.
All of the above. Yeah.
Welcome, guys.
Yeah.
And I
Thank
guess
you.
the topic is building APIs. Yeah, I mean, it's not just the code of how to build an API, but it's the design of how to build an API that's probably even more important, isn't it?
I think it is. I mean, starting from design first, I think is important. But there's also I'm trying to push this idea of sort of polyglot APIs. And what I mean by that is we have a lot of different API technologies, and they don't all work the best for every different sort of scenario. REST works good from the web to the server, but inside between servers and a microservice, we probably want something else. But if we want to go and do streaming, we might want to use something else. And so the idea of a mix of different technologies, sort of like we did with relational and non-relational databases.
Right. I guess, how you lay these APIs out and group them together is probably the first decision that developers of APIs have to make, isn't it?
I think so.
Anybody got a comment on how to approach that?
The go-to option now is just pick something, do HTTP, REST, or let's call it REST APIs everywhere, and shove it to production. I mean, I've seen a lot of folks doing this without thinking at the API design or the constraints or the domain and anything. And they end up with a big ball of mud.
Right.
Not a monolith, but smaller big
Yeah.
ball
Lots
of
of
mud.
monoliths.
A mudolith.
Yep. Exactly.
So I have a couple of things that I like to look for when I consume an API. So when I'm going to build one, naturally, I want to build something that I've consumed that I enjoy, right? The interactive nature of it. I think for me, the first one is it really needs to be self-descriptive and discoverable. Like if you create an API that has a whole bunch of shortened versions of what their actual names are, nobody's going to understand what that is. And you're going to have to go to great lengths to do additional documentation other than just allowing people to hit the API and take a look at what you've got.
So no
You know,
get 1, get 2, get 3 endpoints.
yeah, that doesn't really help.
It's like the equivalent of a variable is named $$ in BASIC.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And while I do, go ahead.
Go ahead, Heather.
Well, I do think that there are some good examples out there of some APIs that are fun to interact with because they're free. I think that we sometimes fall into the hello world scenario where we literally just copy the structure that was put out in a sample, and we don't think about if somebody knew nothing about what I'm trying to build, how would they be able to, handle this? Do the verbs actually match what's happening? I mean, if I do a post, is it really a post? I mean, am I actually updating with that correct verb? Sometimes people just overload verbs and have them do a whole bunch of things. And then that's very confusing to the consumer of the API. So it's important to be very, very clear and just follow some basic standards.
I have a course on designing APIs that isn't about, what technology is being used behind the covers. And I encourage the students in it to start with paper, to literally design your URIs and design your payloads, because a lot of people will worry about or think about the design of an API being just the URL, right? Just movie/1 or person.to. But payloads are also part of that design, understanding what you want that payload to include in different scenarios.
I love that thought, Shawn. Yeah, absolutely. Or on a whiteboard, but to physically write it out is to really make people's hands hurt for their complexity, right? Like if it's a pain to write out, it's not any fun to type out either.
No.
Sure.
And if it's not clear on paper, then it's probably not intuitive, right?
Yeah.
What happens in a lot of REST APIs is people look at their database schema and just mirror it, and that's often not what you really need to do.
Right.
The difference between what a user needs and what you have happen to be stored in your 15-year-old Oracle database might be different.
I think that APIs are like a use case, right? APIs can be a use case. Like, why would somebody need this information? Or why would somebody want to give us this information? They should be use case based, not this is the structure that I've got to store it in, for sure.
Before you even build an API and talk about that, I think a good idea is to have a separate model from the entity. Like the entities are what we talk to the database with, but then have another abstraction, the model, which is what the API and the client work with, right?
Well, I agree. I usually work from the API back for those models, though, because if the need is to get a customer, what is the user really doing with that? Are they listing the customer and the phone number just so they someone can make a cold call, or do they want the customer in every order they've ever had?
Right.
It can be very easy to get bogged down, and so instead of like, oh, I need to make a customer model that looks like the model, what is the API actually serving, and really understanding that ahead of time is hard because not everyone lives in greenfield or has more time, but I think it's worth the effort. I think it's worth the budget of time.
Plus, do you really need to send foreign keys to the client? That kind of thing. You can filter out
or even sensitive data.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's the security question. Oh, but I've got a token. It should be safe, not from the user. You know what I mean? We forget that there are vectors of security, of all sorts.
Sure.
But on the other side, because REST APIs and people don't do REST as it should be implemented, GraphQL showed up. And a lot of people are just switching to GraphQL because REST is bad and so on. Yeah, it's not that bad. You just implement it not so correctly. So I think a problem with overfetching, underfetching, and so on, it is in a small part a problem of bad design over that API or lack of design. So I think that's why. Go ahead.
No.
GraphQL. That's why I think it has its use cases, but in my opinion, now it has so much traction that it shouldn't have. I mean, not so many APIs need to allow their clients so much flexibility.
So we've talked about GraphQL before a little bit, but for those who this is the first time hearing about it, why don't you give us the elevator pitch?
So GraphQL is basically some similar to JSON schema that the client will send each and every time to specify fields that it needs. And they said that this way you just eliminate the underfetching and overfetching problem with the REST APIs. So you say, I need the first name and the email address, and from the address I need that field, and that's only the things that you'll get back in response. The deal is that you won't have caching anymore. You won't have like verbs, different kind of verbs with different kinds of headers. You can add headers, but pretty much that is it. You have a single endpoint that you call and get data. And this gives to the client a lot of flexibility. GitHub, for example, in the version 4, I think, they have this GraphQL API. But not everyone needs GitHub.
Yeah. Lots of GraphQL, the QL meaning query language, is sort of the, in my mind, where it fits. So I tell this story about what technologies I think sort of belong where. And REST to the web is natural. I think GraphQL is for reporting for the most part, because you can set up a schema for the kinds of ad hoc reporting that a lot of companies will need. And so going through the time of building that, information database, which is what it really is, in order to allow that, that's great. But using it for general use, I think it's too easy to open up too much data to too many people. It's a issue of security and of only pushing requirements from the client side. And then something like gRPC I talk about as being inside the data center, or to something like IoT, because those are scenarios where hard contracts can really be a benefit, but not necessarily to the web. And so the different technologies, I think, all have their use cases, but right now we're trying to find one use case for everything. Oh, REST doesn't work in every case really well. Let's bring in GraphQL and let it do everything. Let's bring in this other thing and let it do everything. Let's go back to just XML requests from the web, right?
I mean, there is still a place for
save us.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
I also really appreciate. I do appreciate Irina's. Heather, sorry, make that comment.
No, that's okay.
Go ahead.
There are still use cases I think that RPC is acceptable for. So I mean, I've definitely run into a couple. Even though it's been around forever, I actually, in the right scenario, it works the best. So I would caution you against like showing any favoritism. I know it's really hard in .NET because, my favoritism is like, I want to build everything in .NET, but sometimes the answer is not to do it in .NET. Sometimes the answer really is to build it in JavaScript or build it in PHP or whatever, because it's set up specifically for that scenario just a little bit easier.
Well, now you're just talking crazy talk, Ms. Downing. Goodness gracious.
Know.
At least you didn't say decom. I'm grateful for that.
For example,
Irina.
For example, I was talking about GraphQL at NDC London, and I asked, okay, how many of you are doing REST APIs at the beginning of my talk? And all the hands were up. Okay, I'm doing REST APIs. And then I talked about REST and HOIS and everything that should be there. And then asked again, who's doing REST APIs now? Only 2 hands. So it was very clear that, well, we take REST for granted and say, it's bad. No, it's not that bad. It suits a lot of purposes if you do it correctly. I mean, hate OIS and resource representation and everything, it has a meaning. So, or even with versioning. I mean, I've seen so many APIs having V1 in the URL and dying with V1 there. I mean, come on.
Well, remember
That's
that
not
they're
how
not
you do things.
respecting that version either. So, like, if it's a breaking change, I expect a V2, a V3.
Yeah.
If you have a minor, like something that will not break your schema, then that's fine. But in general, I expect the moment anything changes, I want a V2. I want the next V next.
Well, and isn't that the basic definition of a V2? Is this is a breaking change, and I don't want to mess up my existing users, so I have that V1 there so they can keep working.
Yeah, but
Here's
that's extra
the
work.
V2.
They have to think about changing it. Then they have to think about hosting them side by side. Or do they host them forever? Do they sunset an earlier version? There's all these things you have to start thinking about. If there's going to be versioning, which I encourage you to have, make sure that you think about what is the path to support multiple versions and what is the path to sunset.
Geez, we should do a show on versioning, shouldn't we, Richard?
Yeah, now you're just talking crazy talk.
That's the show that came out today with John Skeet.
Yes, it is. Actually.
Oh, nice. So
how fortuitous. Although
dig our hole in that.
It was also the first show back since you got Corona, and so I think we spent the first half just talking about the world we're in. But
it should have been
when John
Skeet. Yeah.
Well, when John Skeet talks about versioning, you and I both stopped and listened because he's definitely battled that battle. But and I've lived in enterprise service bus projects long enough that this is what we're up against. Like you just can't. An API is forever. Right. You know, bug fixes, yes, but once people are consuming it, I can't tell you that we've ever turned one off. We monitor them to see if there's no traffic left. But like every single time you shut it off, somebody screams sooner or later, typically later when it's much harder to turn it back on. And if nobody's using it, it costs you virtually nothing.
It's a good way to fill up your inbox.
Yep, but the problem is that most of the companies or the systems, the client apps and the APIs are owned by the same company or teams. They do not have the problem of versioning like something that needs to be there and work, because they will just go and change the client app, the Angular, React, or whatever to match the API. And it kind of defeats the purpose.
Right. Richard, you want to break?
Oh, yeah, I guess it's time, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm going to interrupt for one moment for this very important message. And we're back. It's .NET Rocks. I'm Carl Franklin. He's Richard Campbell.
Hey, wait a
and
minute.
Those are an amazing, esteemed panel. Did I say that? I said that. I was being funny. But I did it straight. I did it totally straight. And I'm not fixing it. You can live with it.
That's fine.
It's all good. And in another world, here you go. And in another world, we would be in Porto together right now, sitting on a stage, having this conversation face to face with a bunch of wires and microphones and an audience. And instead, we're doing it online with an audience. I'm in the Slack channel. Folks are watching. We're streaming it over YouTube and a variety of other services. I'm glad we're able to do this together, and I'm glad we were able to put it on. But obviously, been a little more complicated to pull off. This API forever thing is interesting. That I think we often put stuff up and just have no consideration for its impact long term. So I wonder if a lot of time it doesn't have much impact long term. What happens to an API that nobody ever wants to use?
It's an interesting question because I think you do have to plan for APIs to live for a long time. I think one of the points that my other panelists were making was more about how the versioning's done than whether we should do it or not. I know that a lot of companies don't do it at all. I talk a lot about versioning to get it out of the URL, because in order for someone to consume a new version, that means changing every URL in their entire application versus
so now you're
Like
So now you're
query
punishing
string,
people for wanting to use the new thing.
yeah, or making it harder for them to use the new thing. And so your adoption of V1 doesn't go away as much because, if your next change isn't a breaking change, you might want to move everyone over without them having to opt into using
Right.
the old API.
Well, this
So
also
Or Irina's point before the break was you simply force people to use the new version by taking the old version away. It's been updated. You're broken now. Well, you better use the new version, huh?
also
Am I wrong, Irina? That's basically what you were implying.
Not quite. I was saying just because the companies own the client apps that are consuming those APIs and are building the APIs, then they have leverage and control about changing stuff. So this way, they're not forced in a way to change to V2 and then think about deprecating fields or URL or forcing their consumers to switch to the new version. So that's why I think they do not even think about, I don't know, changing to V2 in the life cycle of the project.
So here's a question then maybe for your listeners is, are you building an externally facing API or are you building one in a closed ecosystem? That's like, what are people building right now? Because a lot of times, unless you're bigger, like your Stripe or you are DigitalOcean or something like that, you may not have an externally facing API. It's just going to be for like the multi-divisions you've got going on inside of your company. And that does change things. Of course, you can cheat, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't follow some basic protocols, when it comes to how you build stuff, especially as you have turnover with all of your developers. You don't want the learning curve to be more difficult.
It also
but the
comes down
versioning
to
in
I'm sorry. I'm trying to make a point for 10 minutes, but it's
Go ahead.
It's more like a changing over to the consumer of the API. So you finish your thought, and then I'll change it over.
Oh, okay, great. So this versioning story inside your own API, inside your own applications, I think is still important, especially as people are starting to look at microservices, because we want to be able to deploy them individually, not have a whole release. You're going to want to have maybe some older components of microservices using V1, whereas the new stuff is using V2, and having them both. Otherwise, your API becomes the singular focus of, we need to change and redeploy your entire microservice.
Yeah. If you're consuming APIs and you're, let me say that again. As a consumer of APIs, you're usually writing a service, some sort of class or some sort of module that you can call those APIs through. It's a really good idea. And I know it just seems like obvious, but if you have one field that is the base URL for all of your APIs. So that way, if you want to change versions, it's one variable rather than going through all of your service calls or whatever it is and trying to update those. And it may seem like obvious now, but you know how developers are. They just charge ahead and build out a class with a bunch of static methods and the APIs are hard coded in there. No, put them in a config file and now you can comment out the base URL in the config file, just make one change, and now you're on a different version. And that's of course if the base URL is the version entity.
Right. I would extend that to also the creating of that base URL would include the connection to HTTP, mostly because often you're going to want that same place to put in your headers. Maybe that's a token for authentication. Maybe it's a header for versioning. Maybe it's just some other piece of information. But centralize that creation of your connection to that server, and that's going to include base URL. That's going to include the other sort of overhead of that call that you may need, because that's becoming more and more common.
I have a thought as you've been talking about how people approach, just building just the basic like URL there. Remember, the longer that an API, whether it's inside of your firewall, your company, or it's externally exposed, the longer it lives, the more opportunity there is for exposing it and it getting spammed or misused. So every time I build something now, I have to put on my hat that says, how can somebody misuse this API for either information or to bring down my server or whatever it is? So that's the first thing I look at is, can somebody, like, how would someone misuse this if they got into our system? And so that's where rate limiting is important and logging becomes important. If you start noticing the same IP is spamming you all the time, that may be something that you want to be alerted about. And that's not something that most developers start with. They don't think, oh, what happens if somebody gets in? I now design APIs very defensively before you charge ahead.
One way to mitigate that, if you're not doing it yourself, is to use something like Azure API Service, so that you can set up rules that will automatically do rate limiting. So you can guarantee that, you know, your cluster doesn't get brought down, or one of your servers gets brought down by spam. There's so many good things. I actually did a deep dive into the API service working on a project, and had to do all the research into all the filters and the stuff.
Oh yeah.
Really.
It's also a billing component there too, right?
Oh,
that
yeah.
you can charge people for utilization.
Yep.
It's important to think about that, and that's not something that was originally thought about, even in some of the banking software that I helped create, and in the beginnings anyway, is that we didn't think about what happens when our mobile app gets released, and now our APIs are getting hit all the time by people who want to know all the time if they got their stimulus check, if they got whatever. Are we going to be able to handle this? You know, that's the good traffic, let alone the people who are trying to sniff around and see if they can get, you know, force in a little bit of that URL, and they didn't really lock it down very well. So that's just something that, you know, throw a little chaos engineering at your API. Can you break it? That's the first place to start.
It's just a runaway piece of software.
Yeah.
And deploy it on something bigger than a Raspberry Pi. So that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I've told this story before, but in the old days, I got the local telco put up an SMS service. This is back in like the candy bar phone days, where literally text messages were real text messages. And yeah, I wrote a little app that screwed up and sent me 32,767 text messages in about a second.
I love that story.
And you had to delete each one by hand.
And the phone.
So it takes me about an hour to get to tier 3 tech support, because tier 1 and tier 2 have no idea what the heck I'm talking about.
Right.
When I get to the tier 3 guy, I go, hi, you know, I've been experimenting with your API and I accidentally sent myself 32,767 text. He goes, oh, it's you.
Which happens.
So he clearly.
That happens to be the upper boundary of an integer, isn't it? Or
no, it's not actually. It was of a signed integer. Yeah, that's right. It was a signed small integer. But yeah, clearly the guy on the other end was the guy who just seen that come in and went, wow. It's like, okay, I'm going to delete them on this end. You only have to delete the first one, because it literally would only load them one at a time into the phone. And don't do that again. But, you know, rate limits.
Yeah, I really hate deeply nested objects. So imagine if you had a really nested response from that API on top of how many responses you're getting.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I did the same thing with an email server a long time ago, so I feel your pain.
Azure, AWS, or whatever cloud provider gives us some pieces of technologies to put on top of our APIs. But nowadays, I get the feeling that developers are like, oh, I'm using that. I do not need to design my API properly, or I don't care about status codes or whatever. I'm just using that. When that piece of technology is there to enforce what we already do.
I agree. I think it's a lazy approach to do it that way, for sure, Irina. I think you're completely correct. It also, you don't know what the future brings. Maybe you need to scale things up and you have to move it for some reason to something else. Lately, that has been the case for a lot of our clients. Before I moved to Okta, that they're like, you know what, Azure's too expensive. We cut a deal with Amazon. We need to move over. So what has that just done to your APIs? Right. You know, this should be something that could be self-contained enough that you should be able to pick it up and move it, and it still has some basic thoughtfulness around it.
And remember to design your APIs with status codes in mind. That's another piece of the design. In case anybody doesn't know, there is more than 200 and 500. Those aren't the only two status codes.
There's
How
401.
about 409?
Yeah, comment with your favorite status code.
Yep.
416.
It reminds me of that joke where a bunch of friends get together all the time and they keep telling the same jokes over and over again, much like Richard and me. And
Yeah.
and instead of calling out the jokes, they just numbered them all. Like 416. Everybody goes, ah ha ha.
I mean, I do feel that way a little bit whenever I get a 401 that I didn't expect.
Nice.
Exactly.
I'm looking at the YouTube stream, and there was a question from Hans-Jürgen Bachenes, and I hope I didn't smash your name too much, Hans. Yeah, who asked, should you design your APIs to be infrastructure independent? And I think this speaks to exactly what Irina was saying, was what happens if we have to shift to AWS? Does that make sense to actually make it into infrastructure independent?
At least plan for what you would need to do when you need to move infrastructure. I'm not sure. This is like the old story of writing a database extraction layer in case you need to change database servers. There's a cost there, and if the cost is worth it, at least have a plan. If you aren't going to completely make it.
And Hans makes the example of, if you use API management in Azure, that's an Azure specific feature. If you're shifting to AWS, how are you going to rate limit?
Yeah,
exactly. And so you have to decide how much you're going to hand over in any situation. That's part of the reason why, containerization is such an interesting concept to me, because it forces the developer to still think it doesn't matter where this lives. It just matters what it does, and then it can move from there. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't take advantage of things like Azure Key Vault or anything like that, to interact with your application, because you don't want to be putting everything inside of what you're building. But as I agree with Shawn completely, take an afternoon and just say, let's pretend that we scale. Let's pretend that we take off because everybody's buying our products. How are we going to scale this? Let's just take an afternoon to say, this is what we would do. And that gives you also a basic idea of what to say when you go to the higher ups and say, this is probably what it's going to cost if and when we scale.
Yeah, it's the old startup joke where, you create a startup, you turn it on the internet. The first 10 sales are like, oh my God, this is great. The first 100,000 is like, oh, this is going to be amazing. And when you hit 1 million, you're like, oh, we can't afford to sell it anymore. We can't afford the infrastructure to sell anything.
This also feels very Yagni to me, to plan for moving between clouds. The chances are low. I think I'd rather I don't want to write more code than I have to. And it would be one of the costs of migrating is, we're going to have to retool how we rate limit and bill out our API access.
But
we're not saying that you have to build it all. We're not saying you have to build it all. Just give it some thought. Just like,
for sure.
Where would you like to put that responsibility?
Yeah, and acknowledge that there's a cost.
Yeah.
I mean,
you move it to Bob's Container Store, then you're in trouble no matter what you do.
Yeah, separate issue.
It's like Joe's discountsharkcages.com.
Exactly. By the way, I went to the container store the other day. They don't sell any containers. They just have boxes and lids. I don't know what. They didn't even have. Yeah. Sorry, I talked over you, Irina.
No, what I wanted to say is that vendor cloud lock-in, it's a bit extreme. There might be some business scenarios where, okay, you do not want to be cloud provider locked, but what if something happens, I don't know, and you do not have the money to pay cloud infrastructure, and then you decide to go on-premise somewhere? Your API still needs to be working. I mean, without API management and everything in there, you can switch from Azure Key Vault to, I don't know, holding things into environment variables somewhere in that machine. So then you're ready to switch a few things. Yeah, there are. So,
but it also is sort of a false savings. I'm really going to save money moving on premises, but I have to now write my own API rate limiting layer.
and
Well,
wait
there's
for
a
Dell to
library
ship
for
me
that.
servers.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a library for everything. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I agree. I don't want to create my own stuff that way. I think it's important to use things that are standard for sure. But I have seen too many clients just get burned where they're like, we have to just start over from scratch because now we moved host providers. Like it's, and it wasn't necessary. It literally, they just, you could have contained the damage a little bit. It didn't have to be as dramatic, is what I'm getting at.
But they wanted to write it in React. So how else were they going to do it?
Well, I also think that whole, I'm having problems in REST, so I'm going to redo this in GraphQL. And it's like your own problems follow you anyway, right? It's like, but you get left alone for a few weeks to retool it, which is all you really wanted, is the people stop yelling.
Kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
I know that there's a little bit of a love-hate relationship right now with GraphQL, but we need to pay attention and get good at it because it's not going to go away. It's definitely something that's being embraced specifically by the open source community. And so that's something that we should have an opinion about the right way, to Irina's point, to use something like GraphQL.
And I'm going to paraphrase it.
Now,
go ahead, buddy.
Go ahead, Richard. Sorry. I just want to make sure everyone realizes that REST is becoming the JavaScript of APIs, right? It's the hated thing that actually runs everything.
Yeah.
And nobody does it well.
Yeah.
I'm
going to paraphrase from a comment here from Rico in the chat, where he's asking us to compare REST and GraphQL, but he also mentions gRPC, and we haven't talked about gRPC at all yet. So what about gRPC in the API world?
By the way, Shawn, it's gRPC.
PC.
Oh, it is? Are you sure?
gRPC?
Are you sure?
Yeah. Let's check again.
That's why I have editors.
We're not switching words around for you, buddy.
Yeah,
we're not doing that.
Damn it. So gRPC is interesting, and I think a lot of people like GraphQL think it's the next thing that can fix REST, and I just don't see it. gRPC is contract based. It's actually more similar to WCF in some ways. It's binary, and so I think it's a great solution inter-data center, so server to server, especially in microservices, but also because it works so well in resource constraint scenarios, that IoT, server to IoT, is a beautiful place for it, because the serialization overhead on an IoT device, you just don't want to have to deal with JSON serialization in that case.
Sure.
And because it lives in the same place that something like REST or GraphQL do, you don't have to reinvent the way you authenticate it or authorize it, or it's just more HTTP. It just happens to use HTTP2 instead of being able to work on HTTP1.
So I think comparing REST with GraphQL is like comparing onions to oranges. No pun intended. But I mean, they fit a purpose, scenarios, well-defined scenarios, but I think people should take a step back and understand the technology before throwing into using it into production. Yeah, GraphQL works. It has specific scenario where it shines, but don't say that REST is bad. Don't say, oh, querying REST APIs, sucks. I'm going to GraphQL. I mean, there is OData for querying endpoints and so on. Right?
So she said OData.
Oh yeah,
I said recommended it to a customer recently because their use case was being able to query from Excel, and Excel supports OData out of the box. Doesn't support GraphQL yet. Doesn't report REST, and so even though I'm not a huge fan of OData on the whole, this was the right tool for them, and that's what I wish people would think about more: is what is the right tool? And it isn't about this doesn't work well for me. Like Richard said so well, you're going to take your debt with you. It's sort of like thinking I'm going to get divorced and I'm going to find the right girl. No, you remember that whole stack of magazines that all those issues you have, they're coming with you. You're moving with them.
Yeah.
Jeez.
I didn't know where that was going for a
Yeah,
second.
right.
All right.
Show.
All right, you got there, Shawn. I think you delivered on that one. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Can you cut out the
Irina?
word magazine?
Well,
Nice.
well, here's magazines. What are those? I haven't seen a magazine.
That's true.
But you know, this is sort of like an aesthetic that we profess on .NET Rocks over and over again, which is there's a lot of stuff to know, and the more you know, the better informed decision you can have. So
Mhm.
it pays to have someone on your staff whose sole purpose it is R&D, you know, just to research these things and find out what does that do? You know, what does GraphQL do? What does OData
Well,
do?
and how would that fit in?
And how would that fit into us? Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
it isn't something that you can just take an hour on lunch and go Google your way around and, you know, try to make a decision about a technology.
This
You
is
have
a
to
really
get your
great
hands
way
dirty.
to grow your seniors or your mids in like the next level is give them a task. Hey, give us, you know, the options. I remember for my mobile group that I was in a group at the company before Okta where it was my job to say, okay, here's the client thing. Tell us which platform it should be and why. So that means you get a couple weeks to go and play around with React and native stuff and whatever you want. Just give us a couple of options as what you think would work. And that really grew me in terms of my own chops. So that's a good way to do it.
Nice.
And of course, you know, it also means that your more talented people who have a little bit more responsibility also don't get weighed down with additional R&D that allows the next person to grow.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate this. I presume the panel all supports this then, that you're not going to use only one of these communication layers for everything.
That's how I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, not it's there are hammers and there are screwdrivers.
And pliers.
Yeah.
But now
And as
you're
long as
talking
you're
about a
calling
tool
them
then.
from Silverlight. As long as you're calling them from Silverlight, that's all that really matters.
I almost did a spit take there, Shawn.
Nice. All right.
How we doing on time?
We're the last couple of minutes, friend. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we just have a couple minutes left. Does anybody have any final words or anything that they want to throw out there? Shawn, you said
We have not covered.
You said you had a course, Shawn, that you do.
I have a API design course, and Pluralsight courses are free for the month of April. So this is the chance to go. Yeah,
is it
April.
Still April? Oh, okay.
It is still April.
Still April while we're recording this. It won't be when we publish it.
Yeah, it won't be.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. So go pay for the course.
Yeah. It's important.
Yeah. Now I have a design course. I also sort of want. I've been getting angry about development for a long time, so I decided to start having some rants. So if you go to YouTube/Shawn Wildermuth, you'll see a new series I'm doing of just complaining about software.
I like everything about that.
I love that. How about you, Irina? Is there anything that you want to throw out there? Any resources?
The World Wide Web and technology and docs. And I just want to say that every developer should make an informed decision, not choose the bright and shiny stuff that goes around and changes very often. I mean, just knowing about a piece of tech will allow you to take the best decision for your project. I mean, OData, REST,
Sometimes
and so
RPC is a good idea.
It depends.
That's a great answer. I like that answer a lot.
CGI.
I mean, it depends on the business.
Never a good idea. No. Make the bad man stop.
Computer graphics. No. Heather, how about you?
Well, I do have several YouTube videos out about working with APIs. And of course, I just got started on Twitch. So if you want to follow me, that's my name on Twitch. Yeah.
What is it actually? Because we're listening.
Coraline.
Coraline.
Yeah, spell it.
QUORRALYNE. It's a throwback to Tron Legacy. So, yes. And if you want to follow me on Twitch, and we can kind of create scenario-based APIs together so that you can kind of learn directly. But I also have several YouTube videos on it. I think what I really want to impress upon everyone is to secure your APIs from inception. From the very first time, when you just do a templated API and push it somewhere, make sure you immediately secure it, because you will forget.
Right.
And then you'll get audited later.
How would you know that?
I mean, I worked on some pretty big projects where somebody forgot to put some sort of security in place. And yeah, that's never a good look, and it's never a good thing to face. So just do it up front as just part of, you set up your repo, set up the security from the beginning, and you don't have to think about it anymore. It's just in there.
Very good. And
Great
Heather,
thinking.
you have the last word. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to .NET Rocks, and I'd like to thank Shawn Wildermuth, Irina Scurtu, and Heather Downing. Thank you all. And Richard and I would like to say we'll see you next time on .NET Rocks.